All right. Hello, good evening. Mm, so I've been like poking at this. Let's see, we're gonna move this over into. I've been poking at this thing, and I'm just calling it like React store hooks. And the reason I'm using the term store is because when you think about React in useState, you would never put like a function in, if even if you define it as an object, like you wouldn't put a function in there, or like a method on the object. You consider it values, right? But we also have this very known concept of a store in the React ecosystem, and that represents an object that can have both values and and methods, regardless of like using a class or just a plain object or something more exotic. So let's see here. So what I did now, maybe we can just read through it quickly. So the way I'm going at this now is like, and one thing I want to mention first is like what I find interesting about this is especially this statement of, okay, let's start reading. Have you ever found yourself reflecting on the following? State management in React does not scale. Dependency arrays wreck my brain. Expressing state updates has so much boilerplate. Global state management makes everything so much simpler, but I would love to just use React. And I've thought about this many times. Like, you kind of have to make a choice. Like, do you go with global state management and balance like two different paradigms, or do you like embrace React? And I've tried both, right? And even though I've enjoyed global state management, and had a lot of like success in teams and building products with that, there's always been this like, oh, I wish React could just work the way I want it to work. um, and then we tried to do that at Code Sandbox when we built the new editor, and it just completely, like from a technical state management standpoint of the client, it just, thank God we like shifted to using like VS Code Web there, because it didn't scale. We just couldn't figure out how to only use React. So, but I keep coming back to it. That's the thing, because I would love to just feel like I'm using React, but it just handles all the things I pointed out there. So often hooks are blamed for this frustration, but the problem with React is not its hooks. Well, not all of them, just the ones managing state. But what if we could replace them with hooks that scales, has no dependency arrays, expresses state updates with normal JavaScript, and does not require you to go global? And that's what this is. Instead of useState, use reducer and use callback, you just have useStore and use read-only store. For use memo, you have useStore memo, a weird name, but I'm kind of just trying to use the same naming, only with a prefix store. And then useStore effect and useStore layout effect. And the most interesting thing is useState versus useStore, where updating state in React adds the mental overhead of value comparison. You cannot use native mutation APIs in JavaScript. You're forced to lean on often complex boilerplate, ensuring reference updates to objects and arrays are correct, or components will not reconcile. Will not reconcile, or reconcile too often. Blah, 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 blah. With React store hooks, you can use JavaScript as you know it. So here you use a store and it just works. And then updating state async, we didn't talk about this in the last stream, but that's also a thing. As components can unmount at any time, updating state asynchronously is a challenge in React. A component will error if the state is updated after it has unmounted. This example is considered unsafe. So just a use effect, fetch initial count, and then set the state. If the component unmounts in the meantime, this set state will cause an error. And it's generally just considered unsafe. And like the way to properly handle this is that you need an abort controller, and you have to check. So when you return a disposer from use effect, you'll abort the abort controller, and then here you have to remember to check if the state is okay. But with React store hooks, the component stops subscribing to state changes when it unmounts. So that means any changes made after that does not cause reconciliation. This is considered safe. So when you use, technically you didn't need to use it. I'm a little bit like, so you don't technically need to use a store effect. Maybe we should just call it something else. Like you could use a use effect here as well. But yeah, the point of useStore effect is that it will actually track whatever you access. So that this effect runs again if whatever you access actually changes. But we're not really accessing anything here. We're just setting something. So yeah, whatever. And then exposing state, you want to constrain how your state can change. For example, the counter should only increase. With React, you can orchestrate references for optimal reconciliation with hooks. So you can use the React compiler for this stuff, but I'm not sure how ready that is. But the fact that React even, like one thing is adding concurrent mode because React is so slow because of its state management hooks. And then on top of that, they're adding a React compiler again because the state management hooks is just bad. Like the way they do base it on value comparison instead of observation. It just makes me, this is the thing. This is like, I want to use React, but I only want to use it if it allows me to just use plain JavaScript for managing the state, and that it uses observation so that it just is performant out of the box. And you wouldn't need arguably concurrent mode, and certainly not a React compiler. Anyways, but like again, like I'm sitting here throwing this stuff out, but it's not completely out of the blue, right? Even though I'm maybe not in a position to make that statement, it's not like completely gibberish, right? It's a real thing. Yeah, or you can change the mental model of state and state updates by using use reducer. Yeah, so the thing about like, if you're gonna optimally expose state, you have to make sure that you like use callback for functions. If you're gonna combine, like if you want to expose state and functionality to change that, or methods to change that state, you typically want to expose it as an object. And if you do that, you have to use memo to make sure that that object doesn't change the reference unnecessarily. Because if you pass that object around, right, then that component will reconcile every time the parent reconciles, because you didn't use memo around this object, because this object becomes new every time because of the reconciler. But you can fix this by using a reducer, but that's a completely different mental model for making state updates. And you don't have like plain functions anymore to actually perform the update. So if you're going to actually do something related to changing the state, like you're going to fetch some data or whatever, you still need a function, right? So you still, and then you need to use a callback on that function. And if you want to like combine that functionality into like an object you can pass down to a component, you have to use memo on that object, just like the previous one. It's very frustrating. But with React store hooks, you simply expose the state as read-only from the outside scope. To the outside scope. So here we have the store. Whatever you express inside use counter can just point to store and make changes to it. But from the outside, it you cannot change the count. You have to call increase. And then passing state as props. When passing state as props in React, you need to evaluate how often those props change versus the complexity of reconciliation in the nested component. Should you use memo or not? That's the question. What's the thing? To to be or not to be, to memo or not to memo. And again, we have the example here, and it just shows that if you pass the counter to a memoed component called increase count, that whenever you change the count, this component will reconcile again, even though you're using memo. And that's because the counter object itself changes reference every time the count changes. But if you use memo around this component where you just pass the increase, that will that component will honor the memo, because increase stays the same, right? The increase function, so it's increment here. Okay, let's call it increase. So the increase function here stays the same regardless, right? So that component, it works fine. But if you made count part of the dependency array here, so that you didn't have to do this set state callback to change the count, then that wouldn't be true anymore. And every time you change the count, you'll also change the reference to increase, which means the component will reconcile again. And this is just insane. Like, nobody is able to actually handle this in their brains. Like, it's so insanely complex. And I'm using this counter as an example, which doesn't make any sense, right? But it's when complexity increases. But anyways, with React Store hooks, the way you deal with this is, well, by not dealing with it. You just say, use counter. I want that store to be read-only, as we just did. And it just works. Like, you don't do anything to think about this. It's not exposed to you in any way that you need to consider this or think about this or anything. It just ensures that this store reference will always be the same. Any method defined on it will always be the same. It doesn't matter. And then we get to context. So if you want to expose state management on a context in React, you're pretty much fucked, because the point of consumption of that context, that will reconcile for any change. It does not matter what you consume from the context. Whenever you use context, like the use context hook, that component will reconcile for any change inside the context. So that means in this example, if we chose to expose the counter on the context, both the counter and the increase count would reconcile for any change, even though increase count only consumes the increase method itself. By the way, is this wrong now? Yeah, should we call increase? Increase. It doesn't matter. It will reconcile every single time, but by the sheer fact of it consuming the context. But again, if you use React Store hooks, that's not the case anymore. We have the same code here. We're just exposing it as a read-only store on the context. And now if you use counter in the counter component, this will only reconcile if the actual count changes. And this one will only reconcile, well, it won't reconcile again because it doesn't consume any state. It just consumes the method of increase. So this will keep reconciling, this will not reconcile. And as you can see, there's no observer, there's no memo in this, and that's because it includes a Babel and SWC plugin that makes all components observers. So it just behaves exactly how you expect it to behave. And then we have in React, use memo is used to memorize the result of computing a value. This requires you to manage a dependency array to evaluate when the value should be recomputed. But here you basically just don't need to use the dependency array. And the same is for use effect versus useStore effect. It's just without the dependency array. Yeah, so what I thought we could do is I want to try something. I want to try, I'm going to do useStore, use read-only store, useStore layout effect, and useStore effect, like that. And then we're going to take a look. Oh, useStore memo. Maybe use reactive is better. And then you use reactive effect, use reactive layout effect, use reactive memo. Yeah, maybe that is better. Whatever, it's not that important right now. So we're building this, and then we're actually going to jump into the family Scrum app, because I want to see how this looks like. Close all, git pull, yarn link. What do we call it? Observer React? No, observe. Oh. What did I call it? Oh, come on. Observing React. Hey, why can't I change back? Oh, come on. Why can't I close this? What's that? Oh, is this new? Interesting. Where is it? Family Scrum. Observing React. And I just want to look at how we would actually solve these things. So here I'm using this Bontify thing, which is really just a set of patterns. That is exactly the types of patterns you would apply to components and hooks and everything. But you can apply this pattern to any code, and I'm finding myself using it all the time now. It's like this constructor pattern thing. It's very, very nice. It just, at least for me, it puts me in this flow of always knowing where I'm going to put my code without it getting messy. Anyways, so the way this one works is that we have this session. But what's interesting about this session is that we're actually just going to copy it, I think. Or should I? How should I do this? Okay, we're going to create a separate one. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? Oh, I didn't think about this. Okay, I think we're just gonna fake implement it inside state here. So I wouldn't put the files here normally, but we're just gonna see how it looks. So if I wanted to implement this using this other thing, we can just copy this. And the thing is that we're actually not going to use family Scrum here, because what's different about actually embracing React is that you can't build up these state trees. If you're ever going to nest some state, you actually need to use React itself for that. And hopefully this makes sense. But now being authenticated isn't about creating this nested state tree with the app itself. But when we look at this, okay, so one thing that immediately bothers me, well, first, what bothers me is, let's see, and let's close. Okay, so this is great. This is great for exploration. So we have this use session, and we're passing it the environment from the app. This could now have been use context instead. I didn't have to pass it in like this. Yeah, I think I would rather, okay, so let's just change that. I'm rather gonna consume the environment use env. from like a hook, but then we have this one. We can't do this because this will create a new set of disposers every time, but we actually don't need disposers now, because we're not going to do this nested state management. So, but this one's a little bit icky, right? We only want to look at this to create the initial state. So first thing we need to fix is that we need to support actually having so either state or a function producing the state. And then I think we can just do type of state equals function. We do we call it, or we just return it. So internally we always use useState here. Let's, yeah, don't think I'm actually gonna run anything here, but we need to get the typing. Oh, I'm super tired. I'm not sure how long I'm able to do this. But what we are gonna do here, we need to move this because now we're in React, right? We're just creating a hook. So we can't keep grabbing the cached authentication here. It doesn't make sense. So what we're rather gonna do is say useStore, import useStore from observing React. And then useStore, we're gonna do this. We're gonna return the actual store, and then we're gonna, inside here, we're gonna go and grab from the cache. So when we initialize the initial session store, we are going to go and grab that cached authentication. That's fine. And then we're gonna use read-only store like that. And then we're not gonna do this disposing thing. We can actually just remove that. Okay, but this is interesting. Okay, now it's getting interesting, because what can happen here is that I might change the, sorry. So changing these states happens asynchronously, which means I can't use the hook, right? So here I couldn't actually do this, but I'm not gonna fire up family scrum here anyways. So, and I'm not gonna do family scrum there, but we have family here, and family, and I couldn't use that either. And family, what does that do? Create members. Okay, so I didn't have to use, like the tricky thing here is, okay, I'm moving into this authenticated state, right? But what if the family needs to set up a subscription? Then I'm pretty much fucked. So this is the thing. One thing is like, I can't just use variables like I can now with like going outside of React. I can use these functions and I can just define variables there. I don't have to use refs. I don't have to use this callback thing. But as we're seeing now, most importantly, I have like this subscription going, right? And as part of the subscription, I'm changing out the state of this session. And when I'm authenticated, I might, I want to create this family that might set up a subscription. Like currently it doesn't do it, but you could have a subscription to that family to keep it up to date. And I can't do that. That's the thing about React as well, which is quite hidden, is it's much harder to set up these dynamic things. So for example, what I would have to do is, yeah, and this happens often in React, in the stuff I worked on, is like, okay, for that family to have a subscription only when we're authenticated, I would have to like set up this fake useStore effect. And then I would have to check if session.state current equals authenticated. Then I would return like a subscription on that family, right? But now I move that stuff out here in the effect instead of putting it inside here, creating the actual family. But I can't do it here because this is not part of the the actual component body. So this is the thing that makes me most, yeah, it's very annoying. Because this is like expressing the state machine like I'm doing here is really, really great. I have these functions like all uppercase indicating it's an explicit state and it's returning the state with its name and the values available in each state. But then I'm not able to do any kind of subscriptions or anything on them. Like that's kind of the thing about React, is like you can't dynamically set up effects. You have to, it's tied to the component. Or you can set up dynamic effects, but then you have to set up like these generic effects that's checking the state and then setting up subscriptions based on the state. It's like, it's very, very confusing. And you can't co-locate that subscription with the actual state you moved into. Yeah. Is this for me personally, this is a blocker. Like the useref thing, maybe that doesn't occur that much. So you could live with that. And it's perfectly fine for any like kind of, so here, for example, what we would have to do here, we would have to use store effect instead. And then we'd have to do this. And that's also fine, right? I can also live with that. Like with the benefit of like everything's just in React, I could live with that. But I can't live with this thing, this family thing. So point here as well is that I could just return, let's see, I could just return this. I don't actually need to do this. But I would not be able to set up anything. So I guess one thing I could do though, it still kind of bothers me. I think we can like continue exploring, but so what I could do is like use store effect and then if session state current equals authenticated, I could do like session state family subscribe, for example. But still, this is looking into the family file. I don't know that we're setting up a subscription, right? I don't know who's controlling that subscription. And it's not like literally owned by the family closure, right? The closure of the family function is what should own that subscription, but it can't. But then maybe you could even argue, like, what if I was going to write this from scratch? Maybe yeah, no, it just feels like I'm writing around the whole thing. I don't like this at all. I really don't like this. But again, this is like, yeah. Okay, but that's one thing. And then what's interesting though is that if we would do this, we wouldn't have family scrum anymore when you're authenticated. What will rather happen is when we go to the session component here and we yeah, so what we would rather do here is that we will pass the actual session down instead. So we would say session like this, and then inside family scrum we would say family scrum equals use family scrum, and we would pass the session. Which makes sense to me. Like, we got this authenticated session, we're passing it down to the component that represents the app. We fire up the store, and we give it the session. And that's perfectly fine. Like, that's the dynamic. Like, we talked about this a few times before. Like, how do you handle dynamic state or dynamic state trees? Like, do you globally like use a state machine or whatever you do to like change out the state? You just do that in a state tree, or do you kind of solidify every branch of the tree and then you pass that down to React, and then React is the thing that kind of, when you kind of activate a different branch, you have React kind of instantiating that next branch. You kind of fuse React with your state management, and that's what we're literally doing here. Is that we had this session hook, but it was only concerned about the session, right? It wouldn't actually instantiate the family scrum state. We just passed the authenticated session down, and then this family scrum component is responsible for firing up the family scrum state. And one thing you can't get away with here is instantiation on mount. So if this use family scrum hook required you to instantiate something, that should be disposed when the component, like, it needs to be instantiated during render of, or during instantiation of the family scrum state. It needs to instantiate some third-party class instance that runs some effect kind of thing. You wouldn't be able to dispose of that safely when family scrum component unmounts, because it might not unmount, because it might not mount even though it fires up runs the component body because of concurrent mode. So, but that's also, there's ways to get around that. I think, but that's not the case for like if you go outside of React, because there is no mounting and unmounting outside of React. It's just state management. So, for example, at Code Sandbox, we have a huge problem with this, embracing React, because whenever you render out a dev box, we wanted to connect to that dev box. And that we needed to grab state from the instance of that connection immediately. We couldn't like create a connection on an effect. We actually needed state from that instance immediately. So we kind of created a connection client as we rendered out the sandbox. But then we couldn't safely dispose of it, because even though we created it on render, React can choose not to run any effects or anything because of concurrent mode. Maybe you change sandbox or whatever. And then we would have this like lingering connection, and we didn't know why, but it was because of React. And then you can argue, well, you should not create that client during render, but like it was the most natural thing in the world to do. So, because you couldn't create it on, if we didn't create it on render, we would have to create it on a use effect. And then we would have to apply it to a ref or something. And then the initial render would, well, we couldn't actually assign it to a ref, because when we did actually create it on the use effect, we need to do another render. So we would have to use useState and set the client there. And then you would double render just because you want to do, like, it's very, very annoying. Yeah. No, this is the kind of thing I want to sleep on. But this one, I don't feel like this was a huge success. Yeah, but I really, really want to find something that makes it feel like you're using React like how I hope React would actually work, which is still doing reconciliation, but instead of doing it like doing like these direct, like tie the state management to the reconciler, you would rather have observing components, you would have reactive state, and all components would just subscribe to whatever state it accesses, regardless of it being local, from a prop, it doesn't matter. And then as soon as the component unmounts, it unsubscribes to that state, and then it's all good. And all components like are memoed by default, because in that world, you don't rely on props checking. Like it's in that world, props are typically the same because you're doing mutation. At least you can choose, right? If you could just choose. And that's what we're doing here. We're allowing you to choose. So it doesn't affect any existing like third-party libraries or anything. Those can be like pure React, but then you just have these hooks that just makes your app super performant. You can just use JavaScript. Don't have dependency arrays. Oh. Like I want this to work. But could I like live with this? Could I live with useRef, useStore effect, and then doing this kind of thing? Like, given this state, set up this subscription kind of thing, or do this thing. Maybe. Maybe. Okay, I'm gonna stop the stream. I'm gonna put that in the back of my brain and sleep on it. Yeah. Because this feels very much like what we did at Code Sandbox. Like, we had all the state managed like very clearly in these kinds of things we see here, but then you would have to go somewhere else to figure out what affects. So as an example, like, what if I had a counter as a state machine, and then as soon as I start counting, I set up this interval, and I want that interval to stop whenever I move out of that state. Where would I clear the interval? Yeah, like, where would I clear the interval? So imagine having like an idle state and a counting state. And on the counting state, like, this is counting, we're just setting up like an interval here. Set interval. How would I even do it here? I have an example of this. What the hell? I completely forgot. How the hell would I do that? Was it state tree? Disposing. Oh yeah, but this wasn't a specific state. Yeah, how would I actually do that? So if I wanted, when I'm counting, I want to set up this interval. Yeah, but I wouldn't. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. Or maybe this is fair. So, because what you would do here is like counting, right? And then we would set up some interval, and then we will return a disposer for that. So when you move out of the counting state, it would clear the interval. I think that's certainly fair. But I guess that's the thing I just don't like about state machines. It's like you're kind of separating the logic for like running effects and changing the state. So it doesn't matter how you express it, but these functions, they only represent state changes. They don't represent the actual effects that can occur. But what's good about this is that, like, with a store, you can actually attach methods to these states, which is great. So you know what methods are available in each state. That's a good thing. But these effects, like setting up subscriptions or a counter or whatever it is, you can't express that in the... And it gets tricky. I remember this. Like, what if you want the interval to work? What if you want the interval to work? Let's say you have 3 states, right? And in 2 of those states, you want the interval to be running. But you can't express that with an effect, because even if I do and session state, or session.state equals more counting, like it would still like rerun this effect and clear the interval and set the interval again. So it's definitely not what you want. So you really don't want to use effects for firing off. One thing is using these effects for mounting and unmounting. Like you want to do something when this like instantiates, but you really don't want to use them for managing dynamic stuff. Okay, that's the thing I'm going to sleep on. Like if there's a way to, but this is kind of true for the existing one as well. Like how the hell would I set up an interval here? Yeah, maybe I would even, so maybe what I would do here is like I would actually have the interval. No, I wouldn't want to have that because that would leak out into the, yeah, maybe I would even just have like a ref here. Like let interval, like whatever. And then whenever like you will get unauthenticated or like idle, I would say clear interval. And you can do the same thing here. Like I have to be fair here. It's not because of using React that this is an issue of state machines expressing effects in different states. It's a thing of actual state machines. And if the family here actually set up a subscription in this case, what I would have done here is that I would have passed it like a disposing function. And that's something you can still do. Yeah. You know what? Yeah, no, wait, this is not an issue. So the way I would handle this is like we even had it here. Like if I go back to where we were. So we were, yeah, sorry about this. So we removed some stuff here. Like we had, oh my God. Oh, you know what? Oh, sorry about this. Okay, something like this. And then in the session, you can see I already had it. I had these disposers. So the only thing is I couldn't just define them. I would have to like use ref to do this. And then it feels a little bit icky because it creates a new set every time this thing renders, but it's okay. And this would be like disposers ref. And then in the actual states here, which means that when I'm authenticated, I could pass in like on dispose, and that would like add something to the disposers ref, like the subscription. And then when I'm unauthenticated, I will kind of go to disposers ref current and just clear, or not clear, but for each, I will kind of run through it. Okay. Okay, that's fine. We're gonna say that's fine. And then I'm gonna eat some food. I need to get to bed early. And then I have a lot to do tomorrow, or a lot to do. But there's stuff happening tomorrow on birthdays and stuff. So I'm not sure if I have time to stream. But what we're gonna do, we're just gonna continue this like silly refactor where we're basically gonna take each of these things here and we're gonna make them hooks. And we're gonna look at how the code actually changes. And we can see how we would actually express it. Yeah, so the family Scrum repo is on GitHub. Let me paste it to you. Let's see. And there's like a specific branch. GitHub family. Oh no, not this one. I've been working on this for some time. So family Scrum, and then it's the Bonsai. So the thing we're exploring here on this stream is not is kind of like taking all the explorations from this Bonsai thing, like using that constructor pattern and just like building up state management that way. But here we're doing it outside of React, which is not a bad thing for me personally. It's just this craving of what if you could apply it inside React and just use hooks and everything. But yeah, for sure. I would love for you to like just read through that code because it's kind of interesting. And basically the only thing that would change here now is like the stuff you see in the state folder, that would basically be hooks instead of like what they are now. That's really the only, well, kind of the only difference, I guess. Yeah, broadly speaking. But yeah, awesome. Have a look and jump on the next time and we'll explore some more. Have a great weekend. Bye bye.